the sound of time is about to change. For centuries it belonged to towers and bells, to public squares and shared rhythms. In the early 1500s, time starts to move inward, leaving the high places behind, and entering workshops, clothing, and private life. What follows is the moment when time stops being only something heard and becomes something that can be carried. In the early 1500s, when portable timekeeping first becomes plausible and then desirable, the story often gathers around a single name, Peter Henlein of Nuremberg, and around a new kind of power source, the mainspring. In the late medieval world, a town clock was a civic promise. It was a shared reference, high above the street, telling a market when to open and a workshop when to close. The bell did not need perfect accuracy. It needed authority. It marked hours as rough blocks of life, and for most people, that was enough. But commerce was changing, and so was the pace of travel and correspondence. Merchants moved between cities, contracts multiplied, and meetings became more specific. Time began to feel like something that could be owned, not only obeyed. Nuremberg was a place well suited to this shift. It sat on trade routes. It had skilled metalworkers, and it supported a dense culture of craft. In a city like that, precision was not a distant ideal. It was a habit built into locks, tools, and instruments. It is in this setting that Peter Henlein appears in the historical record, associated with small spring-driven clocks made in the early 1500s. Historians still debate the details, and the credit is not simple. Many hands contributed to the gradual shrinking of mechanisms. Still, Henlein remains a useful figure because he represents a new ambition to compress timekeeping into something a person could carry. To understand what made portability possible, it helps to start with a simple constraint. A clock tower can use a weight, a stone or metal mass, hanging from a rope. Gravity pulls it down, gears slow the fall, and the steady descent becomes motion for the hands. It is reliable, but it is not portable. You cannot walk through a street with a weight and a long drop. You cannot take that system on a horse or hold it in your palm. Portability needs stored force in a smaller form. That stored force was the mainspring. It was not a coil like a modern spiral spring in a pen. It was more like a thin ribbon of metal, tempered and resilient, wound tightly into a compact spiral. When it is wound, it wants to unwind with a steady insistence. The spring is housed in a barrel, a small drum, and as it relaxes, it turns that barrel, which turns a gear, which turns another gear, and so on, until the motion reaches the hands. In a portable watch, this coiled ribbon replaces the falling weight. It takes gravity and folds it into metal memory. Making such a spring was not trivial in the early 1500s. Steel had to be worked to the right balance of hardness and flexibility. Too soft, and it would not push for long. Too brittle, and it would crack. A workshop that could produce a reliable mainspring was a workshop that could produce a new kind of object, one that carried power quietly, without needing height or space. The spring does not announce itself, the way a tower weight does. It sits in darkness, doing its work by pressure alone. This mechanical change also created a new daily relationship with time. A tower clock is maintained by specialists and watched by everyone. A portable watch asks its owner to participate. It introduces the ritual of key winding. A small key is placed into an arbor and turned again. With each turn, the spring tightens, storing more force. Then the time is set, often by adjusting a single hand, because early watches commonly displayed hours without fine minute divisions. After that, the owner does something quietly human. They listen. Not for a clean modern tick, but for proof of motion. A faint, uneven sound, the mechanism speaking in its own rough language. These early portable watches are sometimes described by their silhouette. Later collectors would call some of them Nuremberg eggs, because certain cases were rounded, slightly oval, and small enough to hang on a chain. The term itself is complicated and may reflect later fashion and later storytelling as much as early design. But the image remains useful. A rounded case in the palm, metal warmed by the body, time kept close, not above. Even when the shape was not truly egg-like, the idea was present. Time as a personal object, carried as jewelry, as status, as a quiet marvel. The status mattered, but it was not only vanity. Owning a portable watch in the early 1500s was a signal that you moved through a world where hours had weight. A person with appointments, with travel plans, with negotiations, could benefit from a portable reference, even if it was imperfect. Accuracy at this stage was limited. These watches could drift significantly over a day. They were sensitive to how they were carried, to temperature, to the quality of the parts. But even an imperfect personal clock could be useful, because it offered consistency within the owner's own routine. It allowed someone to say, with some confidence, that a meeting would happen around a certain hour, not merely after the next bell. Inside the case, the problem was not only storing energy, it was releasing it in controlled steps. If the mainspring were allowed to unwind freely, the gears would spin too fast and the hands would blur. The key mechanism that prevents that is called the escapement, and in early portable watches, it could feel and sound clunky. A common early form used a crown-shaped wheel and a simple controlling assembly, releasing the gear train in rapid little checks. Rather than a smooth, calm tick, the motion could resemble a controlled rattle, a repeating interruption that keeps the spring from spending all its force at once. This is where the story of portability meets the story of regulation. A spring can provide motion, but a watch needs a heartbeat. In the early 1500s, before the balance spring existed, the regulating system was crude compared with later standards. The balance would swing, but its period was not as stable. The result was a timepiece that ran, but did not run evenly. It might speed up when newly wound, and slow as the spring relaxed. It might change character depending on position, because gravity still influenced the moving parts, just in subtler ways. When people later demanded precision, this unevenness would become unacceptable. For now, it was tolerated because the very fact of portability felt extraordinary. The mainspring itself explains much of this uneven behavior. When fully wound, the coiled ribbon is under high tension. It presses with a strong urge, and the gear train feels that pressure. As time passes, the spring unwinds, and its force fades. It does not stop suddenly, it gradually tires. That change is physical, like a hand that grips firmly at first, then relaxes. Without a system to smooth that force, the escapement receives a stronger push early on and a weaker push later. The watch can gain time at the start of its run and lose time toward the end, even if everything else is well made. This is why early owners developed habits around their watches. Winding was not merely maintenance. It was a way to keep the spring operating in a familiar range of force. Some would wind at the same time each day, trying to keep the system away from its weakest state. Setting the time might involve comparing against a public bell or a known reference, then adjusting the hand with care. The watch becomes a small negotiation between the certainty of metal and the uncertainty of motion. The owner is not just reading time, they are managing it. Peter Henlein, in this atmosphere, can be imagined less as a solitary inventor and more as a skilled worker within a city of skilled workers. Nuremberg was full of makers who understood gears, pivots, and the patient discipline of filing and fitting. Henlein is often associated with locksmithing, a craft that also deals in small, precise parts and in the controlled release of force. It is a fitting background, even if the details are debated, because locks and watches share a logic. Both hold energy in restraint. Both release it through structured steps. Both depend on surfaces that must meet cleanly and on tolerances that must be respected. It is also worth noticing what these early watches did to the idea of time itself. A tower clock speaks to a community. A portable watch speaks to an individual. It allows time to be checked in private without waiting for a bell. It invites an owner to look at time more often because the act becomes easy. Over years and decades, that simple accessibility changes behavior. It makes punctuality more personal. It makes scheduling less dependent on shared signals. It also makes time a commodity in a new way, something that can be displayed, gifted, inherited, and admired. Even the way these watches were carried reinforced this shift. Hung from a chain, tucked into clothing, or held in the hand, they kept time close to the body. The warmth of a pocket could affect the metal slightly, and the movement could respond. The watch was no longer an abstract measure overhead. It was a companion object with moods and flaws, sometimes fast, sometimes slow, always mechanical. Owners learned that timekeeping was not a single number. It was a process, powered by a coiled spring and moderated by an imperfect escapement. By the end of the 1500s, the novelty of portability had proven itself. The question began to change. It was no longer only, can a watch run in your pocket? It became, can it run evenly from the first strong hours after winding to the last tired hours before it stops? That problem, the uneven pull of the mainspring, would lead to a new solution, one that looks almost like a tiny piece of rigging, a cone and a chain, designed to make changing force feel steady. Now portable timekeeping faces its first real test. A watch can run in the hand or in a pocket, but running is not the same as keeping steady time. In that same era, the question shifts from possibility to reliability. In the late 1500s, makers confront an obvious flaw in the early spring-driven watch. The mainspring is powerful at first and weaker later, and the hands do not move evenly. The response is a clever piece of mechanical reasoning, the fusee and the chain, a way to smooth changing force without changing the spring itself. It matters because it turns portability into something more dependable, and it quietly prepares the ground for better regulation still to come. In workshops across Europe, the same pattern appears. A newly wound watch runs eager and fast, then grows tired and slow. Owners notice it in ordinary moments, when a bell arrives earlier than expected, or when a meeting begins before the watch suggests it should. A watchmaker hears these complaints without surprise, because the cause is built into the power source. A coiled spring does not push with the same strength from start to finish. It relaxes, and its pressure declines. The mainspring lives inside a barrel, a small drum with a lid. When it is wound tight, it presses hard against itself, and it wants to unwind quickly. When it has already unwound for hours, its pull is calmer, almost reluctant. The gears connected to that barrel feel those changes directly. Early escapements were already imperfect at controlling speed, so the changing push from the spring becomes a changing rate at the hands. The problem is not subtle. It is mechanical, and it is consistent. The fusee is one of the first elegant answers to that problem. It does not make the spring stronger, and it does not make the escapement smarter. It changes leverage. It introduces a cone-shaped pulley, tall on one end, narrow on the other, cut with a spiral groove. Next to the mainspring barrel, a tiny chain links the barrel to this cone. The chain is not decorative. It is a working part, built from many small links, each one shaped to bend smoothly around curves. It helps to imagine a simple idea, taken slowly. If a strong hand pulls on a short wrench, it does not need much leverage. If a weaker hand pulls later, it benefits from a longer wrench. The fusee does something similar, but it does it continuously. When the mainspring is strongest, the chain pulls on the smallest radius of the cone. That small radius reduces the turning force delivered onward. As the mainspring weakens, the chain shifts toward a larger radius. That larger radius increases leverage and helps the weaker spring feel stronger at the gears. The chain seems almost alive in the way it moves. It does not stay fixed in one place. As the watch runs, it climbs and descends along the cone's spiral groove, one link at a time. When the watch is fully wound, Much of the chain sits wrapped around the fusee. When the watch runs down, the chain transfers gradually to the mainspring barrel. The cone is shaped so that this transfer changes leverage in the right direction, countering the spring's fading strength. In the late 1500s, this is not only a technical improvement, it is a statement about what people now expect from a watch. The first portable watches could be admired even when they were unreliable, because they were new. A fusee watch suggests that novelty is no longer enough. Owners want a timepiece that behaves the same at noon as it did at dawn, within the limits of the era. Watchmakers feel the pressure to deliver something steadier, and steadiness requires more than careful filing. It requires a mechanism that corrects the spring's nature. This added mechanism also adds labor and risk. A fusee chain is delicate. It must be strong, but it must also flex easily. It cannot be too stiff, and it cannot stretch much, because stretching would change the timing. A broken chain can stop the watch, or worse, it can let a spring unwind suddenly and damage parts. Makers learn to treat the chain with respect, fitting it carefully into the groove, checking its path, and ensuring it does not snag. The fusee itself demands careful shaping. The cone is not a simple cone. Its curve is chosen to match the spring's changing force. If it is shaped poorly, the correction will be wrong. Too much leverage too soon, and the watch may drift the other way. Too little, and the problem remains. In a world before modern measurement tools, this shaping comes from practice, from workshops building, testing, and refining by experience. A good fusee is not only geometry, it is a record of attention. One human moment repeats across these workshops. A watchmaker wins a watch fully, sets it by a known reference, then waits. He checks it again after hours, then again toward the end of the run. He listens to the sound of the escapement. The sound is not only noise, it is information. A watch that speeds up may sound sharper and more hurried. A watch that slows may sound thicker, less crisp. The maker learns the personality of each movement, and the fusee becomes one of the tools used to calm that personality. For the owner, the fusee changes the experience in quieter ways. The ritual of winding still matters, but the result feels more consistent. Early watches often had only an hour hand, and their dials reflected a world less obsessed with minutes. Even so, people could tell when a watch was wildly uneven. With a fusee, the watch can feel less moody. The first hours, after winding, no longer rush ahead with the same confidence. The last hours before stopping no longer sag so dramatically. Time begins to behave more like a steady flow, even if it is not yet precise. The principle can be anchored in something simple. Think of lifting a bucket from a well. At the start, when the rope is wrapped tightly around the axle, each turn pulls in a certain length. As the rope shifts and wraps differently, the length per turn changes. Now imagine shaping the axle so that it changes radius deliberately to match how heavy the bucket feels. That is the logic of the fusee. It is a controlled change of radius designed to control how force is delivered. Some fusee systems also include a quiet safety, a way to prevent overwinding, or to limit the spring's harshest range. These ideas are sometimes grouped under the broader concept of stopwork. The goal is similar: to keep the spring working within a more reliable band of force. In the late 1500s, solutions vary, and the details differ between makers and regions. The shared aim remains clear: to stop the watch from being ruled by the first violent hour of a fully wound spring. As fusee watches spread, the geography of watchmaking becomes more visible. Different cities cultivate their own habits of design, finishing, and case making. Makers learn from each other, sometimes directly, sometimes through trade, sometimes through imitation. Watches move as objects of prestige, exchanged as gifts, purchased by elites, carried by merchants, and discussed as wonders. But alongside prestige, a subtler value grows: trust. A watch that runs more evenly becomes a tool, not only a charm. The fusee and chain do not solve everything. Even with steadier force, the regulation of time is still limited. The balance mechanism of the era does not yet have the stable heartbeat that later watches will gain. Position changes, temperature shifts, and friction still alter the rate. The escapement still releases energy in rough steps. Yet the fusee makes a key promise possible. It separates, at least partially, the problem of power from the problem of timing. It offers a steadier push so that any regulator can do its job more consistently. There's also a quiet philosophical change here, one that fits the late 1500s. A portable watch is no longer only a reduced tower clock. It is becoming its own kind of machine with its own methods. A tower clock uses a weight and accepts the steady pull of gravity. The portable watch uses a spring and must correct that spring's temperament. The fusee is a way of disciplining stored energy. It is a small lesson in control, built from metal and patience. If the fusee is pictured clearly, it becomes easy to remember. A cone beside a barrel, joined by a chain. The cone is tall at one end and narrow at the other. The chain moves slowly along the cone as hours pass. It chooses the narrow part when the spring is strong, and the wider part when the spring is weak. Constant force, achieved by changing leverage, one small link at a time. By the end of this period, a watch can be both portable and more evenly driven. It can be worn with greater confidence, not because it is perfect, but because its errors are less wild. The device has gained a new layer of thought, a solution shaped like a cone and articulated like a chain. And with power now steadier, attention turns to the next limitation, the mechanism that decides the rate itself. Then, with the fusee smoothing the push of the mainspring, the watch gains steadier power. But steadier power is only half of the bargain. What still matters is the part that decides the pace, the small mechanism that says, "This much time has passed," and then says it again. This next step is treated as a turning point, the moment the watch begins to behave like an instrument. In the middle of the 1600s, makers and thinkers were chasing a simple promise. They wanted a repeated motion that would take the same amount of time each time it happened. They wanted a true heartbeat for portable time. A pendulum had already shown what regular time could feel like. Around 1657, Christian Huygens was closely tied to the rise of pendulum clocks and to the new confidence they created. The pendulum offered a rhythm that was not argued into place by gears alone. It was a physical motion that returned again and again with remarkable sameness. It suggested that timekeeping did not have to be a negotiation with imperfect parts. It could be anchored in a natural swing. But the pendulum carried its own limitation. It needed gravity in a specific way. It needed a stable orientation, a predictable hang, and room to move. It was excellent on a wall, in a tall case, in a quiet interior. It could not live in a pocket, or on a chain, or in the shifting angles of a person walking. A portable watch needed a heartbeat that did not depend on hanging straight down. The portable oscillator of early watches was a balance wheel, a small weighted wheel that could rock one way, then the other. It was paired with a simple escapement that nudged it along and counted its motion in tiny steps. In principle, it was the right idea. A balance wheel could move in any orientation. It could turn in place inside a compact case. But early balance systems had a problem that was hard to ignore. Their rhythm changed when conditions changed. Imagine a child on a swing. If the push is strong, the arc is wider. If the push weakens, the arc shrinks. With a pendulum, the timing stays surprisingly steady across a range of arcs. With early balance wheels, the timing drifted more easily. The balance wheel was less protected from variations. Changes in drive force, friction, and the position of the watch could all change the rate. The result was not just inaccuracy. It was inconsistency, the sense that the watch could not agree with itself. This is where the story turns toward springs and toward a different kind of return. A spring is a promise made of metal. You bend it or twist it, and it tries to come back. You do not have to persuade it with gravity. You do not have to hang it carefully. The spring carries its own preference for a neutral position, and that preference can be used to regulate motion. In London, Robert Hooke was a figure of restless curiosity. He moved between experiments, instruments, sketches, and arguments. He was involved with the early Royal Society in an environment where ideas traveled quickly and credit could become sharp. Hooke studied many kinds of motion, including the behavior of springs. He noticed that within a useful range, a spring pushes back in a predictable way, stronger when it is displaced further. This was not just a convenient observation. It was a pathway to regular oscillation. At almost the same time, in the Netherlands and in France, Huygens was working with a different style of attention. He was a mathematician as well as an inventor, and he cared about shapes, curves, and timing. He had already considered how a pendulum could be made to swing more evenly, even experimenting with geometric guides. He was drawn to the dream of equal intervals, not as poetry, but as a mechanical fact that could be designed. When the balance spring arrives, it is almost modest in appearance. It is a thin strip of steel formed into a tight spiral. Later, it will be called a hairspring, not because it is soft, but because it is slender and delicate. Its purpose is not decoration. Its purpose is to give the balance wheel a restoring force, a gentle twist that turns motion into rhythm. To picture it, imagine a balance wheel mounted on a central staff. One end of the spiral spring is attached to that staff. The other end is anchored to the fixed frame of the movement. When the balance wheel turns, it twists the spring. The spring resists and then helps pull the wheel back the other way. The balance swings left, it slows, it stops, it returns. It swings right, it slows, it stops, it returns. The spring does not push in steps. It pushes smoothly, changing its force as it twists, like a quiet, elastic memory. The escapement still has a role, and it remains a source of character in the sound and feel of the watch. The escapement is the part that lets the gear train advance in small increments. It also gives the balance a tiny impulse, timed to keep it moving. This relationship can be understood with a simple comparison. Think of a spinning top that is slowly losing energy. A finger touches it at the right moment, giving a small correction, not enough to change its nature, just enough to keep it alive. In a watch, the impulse is engineered into a repeating interaction between the escape wheel and the oscillating balance. The spring turns that interaction into a steady beat. Once the balance spring is in place, the watch becomes less sensitive to the changing strength of the mainspring. The fusee has already done important work by evening out the torque. Now the balance spring adds a second kind of stability of rate. In the old system, a stronger push might make the balance behave differently, speeding or slowing in a way that was hard to predict. With the spring, the balance is more willing to keep its own timing. The promise is not perfection, but a narrower range of error. This is the moment when the word heartbeat starts to feel literal. The balance wheel and spring do not just move. They repeat with the same kind of insistence that a pulse repeats. Left, pause, right, pause. Not because a person is listening for it, but because the mechanism relies on it. The entire train of gears, from the mainspring barrel through the center wheel and onward, is paced by that alternating motion. In workshops, this shift would have been visible in the daily work. A watchmaker could adjust a watch and see changes that held more reliably. Regulation becomes less like wrestling with a stubborn object and more like tuning. It is still delicate, still full of compromise, but it is now possible to make a portable timekeeper that behaves similarly from 1 hour to the next. The human story of this invention is not perfectly clean. Historians still debate the details of priority and the precise sequence of experiments and demonstrations. Both Hooke and Huygens are closely associated with the idea of using a spring to govern a balance. In Paris, Huygens worked with a skilled clockmaker named Isaac Thuret, and their collaboration became strained by questions of credit and control. Letters and drawings traveled between cities, and so did rumors. In a world without instant publication, a few months could matter. In a world where reputations were built on novelty, a few weeks could matter. It is worth holding these disputes gently, because the mechanism itself does not depend on who spoke first. The balance spring works because it is a physical answer to a physical question. How do you create a regular oscillator that fits in the palm and functions while carried? The spring provides a restoring force that is internal, not gravitational. It makes the balance wheel behave like a controlled swing, even when the watch is tilted, jostled, or moved. Still, the new heartbeat brings its own vulnerabilities. A spring is sensitive to temperature. Metal changes slightly with heat and cold. The elasticity of the hairspring can shift, and the size of the balance can change, and the oils can thin or thicken. The very success of the balance spring draws attention to smaller sources of error, the kind that had been lost inside larger chaos before. Friction is one of those quiet enemies. Every pivot that turns in a hole, every tooth that slides, every surface that presses, steals a small amount of energy. It also wears slowly, invisibly at first. A watch with a balanced spring can keep steadier time, but only if its motion remains smooth. If a pivot is rough or a hole is worn, the balance may lose amplitude in uneven ways. If oil dries or migrates, the rate can wander. The watch has gained a heartbeat, but that heartbeat can be disturbed by tiny imperfections. And yet, for the people living with these objects, the change is unmistakable. What was once an impressive novelty, a portable machine that ran at all, becomes something closer to a standard. Timekeeping begins to shrink its errors from hours toward smaller fractions, toward minutes, and eventually toward seconds in the best cases. The watch starts to support coordination, travel, trade, and personal ritual with a steadier presence. It starts to feel like it can be trusted, not absolutely, but consistently. As this story continues, the improvements do not stop at the balance spring. Once the heartbeat is steadier, the rest of the mechanism comes under a harsher light. The question becomes how to protect that heartbeat from slow decay. The heartbeat has found a steadier form in the balance wheel and its thin spring. The watch can repeat a rhythm with a confidence it did not have before. And now a quieter problem steps forward, the slow loss of precision through friction. This section is about that quiet enemy, metal touching metal, hour after hour, day after day, until small surfaces change shape. It is also about an answer that looks almost decorative, but is not. Around 1704, watchmakers begin placing hard stones inside the movement as tiny bearings for steel pivots, so parts can turn with less resistance and far less wear. To understand why this mattered, it helps to picture what a watch is doing when no one is looking. Every wheel in the gear train turns on a pivot, a slender steel tip that sits in a hole. The hole is cut into a plate of brass, or a bridge, or a small supporting arm. At first, the fit can be neat. It can feel smooth on the bench, but as the watch runs, the contact repeats endlessly. Steel rubs against brass, and both surfaces slowly change. Friction is not just a loss of energy, it is a change in behavior. When friction rises, a wheel turns with more reluctance. The escapement delivers its impulses with a slightly different result. The balance may swing with a smaller arc. The rate can drift, not in a dramatic leap, but in a slow, uncertain slide. This is how accuracy dies slowly, through a chain of tiny changes that build over months and years. In the late 1600s, as the balance spring spreads and portable timekeeping improves, these smaller losses become easier to notice. When a watch is already wildly inconsistent, where is hidden inside noise? When a watch becomes steadier, where becomes a visible cause? A maker can regulate a watch, see it behave well, then watch it fade as pivots score their holes, and oils dry and surfaces roughen. Lubrication helps, but lubrication brings its own limits. Oils can thicken in cold. They can thin in heat. They can attract dust. They can creep away from the place they were meant to sit. In an era before modern sealing and filtration, keeping a movement clean was a constant struggle. The promise of a better heartbeat now depends on something humble, a clean bearing, and a stable film of oil. The solution that begins to take shape is simple in concept and difficult in practice. Replace the soft, bearing surface with something far harder than steel. Give the pivot a smooth, consistent cradle. Make that cradle small, polished, and precise. The chosen materials are stones, especially ruby and sapphire, valued not for their color, but for their hardness and their ability to hold a smooth surface. A jewel bearing is a tiny disc, pierced with a hole, and set into the plate or bridge. The pivot rests in that hole and turns. Because the jewel is hard, it resists wear. Because its surface can be polished finely, it offers low friction. And because the hole can be shaped with care, it can hold the pivot in a consistent position, reducing the subtle wobble that grows when brass wears unevenly. It is worth pausing on the scale of this. These are parts small enough to hide under a fingernail. Their surfaces are finished to a level that would have seemed extravagant in other crafts. And yet, their job is not luxury. Their job is to let parts touch less, to let motion continue with fewer losses. In London, in the early 1700s, a new set of names appears in this story. Nicholas Fatio de Dulier was a mathematician and scientist with strong ties to the intellectual life of the city. He worked with the de Beaufort brothers, Peter and Jacob, who were watchmakers in Soho. Together, they are associated with a key step, not only the idea of jewel bearings, but the practical method of piercing hard stones so they could be used reliably in a movement. Records describe an English patent granted on 1 May 1704 for this technique. The human details here are textured, as they often are when ideas become valuable. Fatio's method for working jewels was treated as a secret, and it was worth guarding. It promised real improvements in durability and precision, and it arrived in a competitive craft. There were disputes and objections, including resistance from established guild structures in London, and debate over whether the idea was truly new, or whether earlier watches had already used stones in certain places. Without getting lost in courtroom language, the mood can be understood. A watchmaker's livelihood depended on skill and reputation. A new technique that offered an advantage could change who was trusted, who was hired, and who was copied. A patent could feel like protection to its holders and like a barrier to others. The result is a familiar tension, a quiet struggle over credit, access, and control, happening inside a craft that often presents itself as purely precise and calm. In the workshop, though, the jewel is less a political object than a mechanical one. It changes the way the movement wears. If you imagine a steel pivot spinning in a brass hole, you can picture the brass slowly widening, like a door hinge that loosens over time. The pivot begins to sit slightly off-center. The wheel begins to mesh imperfectly. Power leaks away through rough contact. Now imagine that same pivot turning in a jewel, a small polished circle that holds its shape. The pivot still needs oil, but the bearing remains consistent far longer. This brings us to one of the most quietly clever features of a jeweled bearing, the oil sink. In many jewel settings, the area around the pivot hole is shaped into a tiny shallow bowl. The purpose is not decoration. It is a reservoir. A single droplet of oil can settle into that depression and remain there, held by surface tension, feeding the pivot slowly as it turns. It is an elegant use of physics at a microscopic scale. The oil does not want to spread thinly across the whole plate. It gathers in the hollow. The pivot, as it moves, draws a trace of that oil into the contact point. The bearing stays lubricated longer, with less mess and less migration. This is part of why jewel bearings improve not only friction, but stability over time. They help the watch keep behaving like the watch that left the bench. Jewel bearings also change where attention is focused. The balance, with its spring, depends on consistent conditions. It is sensitive to losses. If friction rises in the train, the balance amplitude changes. If amplitude changes, the escapement behaves slightly differently. The whole system shifts. By reducing friction at key points, especially around the balance staff, jewel bearings help protect the heartbeat itself. This is also where the misunderstanding of jewels begins and persists. In common language, jewels are associated with ornament. In watches, the word points to function. These stones are placed where they matter most, at pivots and contact points, because they reduce wear and resist corrosion. They are not meant to be seen. They are meant to keep moving. The spread of jeweling is gradual. Early jeweled watches often used stones at the most critical pivots, not everywhere. The work was difficult, the material was costly, and the precision required was high. Over time, as the benefits became clearer, jewels appeared in more places, in better grades of movements, until jeweling became a standard marker of quality. There is a gentle irony in this progression. each improvement makes the watch more stable and also makes new sources of error more obvious. The balance spring reveals the problem of friction. Jewel bearings reduce friction and reveal other problems, such as temperature effects, shock, and the complex behavior of escapements. The closer the mechanism comes to regular time, the more it becomes an instrument that must be protected from the world. In the early 1700s, this protection is not yet a complete system. There are no modern shock absorbers. Cases vary in tightness. Oils are inconsistent. Still, the use of jewels is a clear step toward durability and toward a watch that can keep its character longer. It is an answer to a question that only appears after earlier questions have been partly solved. It is an answer to the passage of time inside the movement itself. If you hold the whole watch in your mind, it becomes a kind of layered calm. The mainspring stores energy, then gives it up. The fusee smooths that energy into steadier force. The escapement divides that force into measured pushes. The balance and spring turn those pushes into rhythm. And now, the jewels protect the places where motion would otherwise grind itself away, turning roughness into drift. This is why jewel bearings belong in the story of precision, not the story of luxury. They are part of the watch becoming reliable as a long-lived machine. They help keep the rate from changing as the movement ages. They keep pivots from chewing through their seats. They keep oil where it is needed. They extend the life of the heartbeat. And with that durability, the watch begins to step into a larger world of demands. It is one thing to keep time on a desk, or in a pocket, in a familiar town. It is another thing to keep time across oceans, through storms, salt air, vibration, and changing temperatures. As the 1700s unfold, timekeeping becomes tied to navigation and survival, and the question of longitude presses on governments, captains, and instrument makers. From here, the story moves outward, from the private object to the public problem. With jewel bearings helping the movement keep its smoothness longer, a watch can hold its character for more days and more seasons. The heartbeat is steadier, the friction is quieter, and the mechanism begins to feel dependable. And then, the world asks the watch to do something harder, to keep time not on a table, but on a ship. In the 1700s, navigation at sea becomes a test of timekeeping. Latitude can be estimated from the height of the sun or stars, but longitude asks a different question: how far east or west a ship has traveled. That distance cannot be read directly from the sky without careful mathematics and clear observations. It can be read from time, if time can be carried reliably across an ocean. A ship at sea can always find local noon in a simple way. Local noon is the moment the sun reaches its highest point, the moment its shadow is shortest. But local noon alone does not reveal where you are on the globe. To find longitude, you need to compare local time to a reference time, a time kept at a known place, such as a home port or an observatory. The difference between those two times becomes a measure of east and west. The The idea rests on a calm piece of geometry. The Earth turns once in about 24 hours. As it turns, the sun appears to move across the sky. If the Earth turns a full circle in 24 hours, then in 1 hour it turns a small portion of that circle. That portion corresponds to 15 degrees of longitude per hour. In other words, a time difference becomes an angle. An angle becomes a position on a map. To make this practical, imagine a clock that never leaves London or another agreed reference. It keeps the reference time day after day. Now imagine the same clock traveling on a ship. At sea, the crew observes local noon when the sun peaks. At that moment, the traveling clock might read a different time. If it reads later than noon, the ship is west of the reference, because the sun reached noon later there. If it reads earlier than noon, the ship is east of the reference, because noon arrived sooner. With each hour of difference, the ship is about 15 degrees away in longitude. This sounds clean when spoken slowly, but in practice, it was a matter of life and loss. Errors in longitude could put a ship on the wrong side of land, or leave it searching for a harbor that was not where the chart said it should be. Mistakes could compound with weather, currents, and fatigue. In the early 1700s, European powers were moving more ships across longer routes, and the pressure to navigate accurately was rising. There were other methods. Astronomers developed techniques that used the moon and the stars, comparing observed positions to tables. These methods could be accurate, but they demanded clear skies, careful instruments, and time for calculation. They were possible, but not always practical in rough weather or in the cramped rhythm of shipboard life. A dependable clock offered a different kind of hope. It promised a reference time that was always present, even when the sky was not cooperative. In the early 1700s, political institutions took notice. Rewards were offered for a workable solution, with the size of the prize tied to how accurate the method could be over long voyages. The details of these schemes changed over time, and arguments followed, but the message was simple. Accurate timekeeping at sea was not a luxury. It was strategy. This is where John Harrison enters the story, not as a theorist at a desk, but as a builder who trusted his hands. Harrison began as a carpenter, and that background matters. A carpenter learns how materials move, how joints bind, how friction steals motion. He also learns to build for stability, to anticipate warping and swelling, to keep structures true over time. When Harrison turned his attention to clocks, he brought that sensitivity with him. In early designs, Harrison worked with careful craftsmanship and unusual choices of material. He looked for ways to reduce friction and reduce the need for thick oils that could change with temperature. He aimed for smooth contact, stable force, and a mechanism that could keep its behavior consistent. His work is often described as patient, stubborn, and methodical, which is another way of saying it was suited to the slow demands of precision. A pendulum clock, even a good one, is not happy on a moving ship. The pendulum depends on a steady frame and a stable vertical direction. On land, gravity provides that quietly. At sea, the deck tilts and heaves. The pendulum is pulled into irregular arcs, and its rhythm is disturbed. So the marine timekeeper could not simply be a pendulum clock placed on board. It needed a different oscillator, something that could keep time while the ship moved. Harrison's early sea clocks, often called his first and second timekeepers, were large, complex machines. They did not look like pocket watches. They looked like careful engines, built to resist the violence of motion. They used balances rather than pendulums, and they used escapements designed to waste less energy in sliding friction. They were also mounted in a way that tried to isolate them from the ship, so the movement could live in a calmer space inside the larger chaos. This idea of isolation becomes a theme of the marine chronometer. The clock is placed in a protective box. The box is often mounted on gimbals, rings that allow it to remain level as the ship rolls. The intention is not to remove motion entirely, because the sea will not permit that. The intention is to filter motion, to let the clock feel slower, gentler changes rather than sharp jolts. It is timekeeping as a sealed, quiet room inside a storm. But even a protected clock must face another invisible threat: temperature. A ship crosses latitudes and weather systems. It moves from warm air to cold air, from dry air to damp air, sometimes in the span of days. Metal responds to these changes. Brass and steel expand when warmed and contract when cooled, but they do so differently. A part that is perfectly sized in one temperature can become slightly too tight or slightly too loose in another. Thermal expansion sounds like a small issue, but in a precision instrument, it can change everything. If a balance wheel grows slightly larger, its inertia changes. If a hairspring becomes slightly stiffer or softer, the timing changes. If pivots shift in their holes by a tiny amount, friction changes. These are not dramatic failures. They are quiet drifts. At sea, quiet drifts accumulate into miles. So one of the mechanical goals of the marine chronometer becomes compensation, a way for the instrument to correct itself as temperature changes. The basic idea is simple. If one part changes with heat, add another part that changes in the opposite direction, so the net effect cancels out. It is like building a scale that stays balanced as the room warms. In clocks on land, one famous approach used alternating rods of different metals, arranged so that as the temperature changed, their expansions opposed one another. The goal was to keep a critical dimension stable, so the pendulum's effective length did not wander. At sea, where balances were used, compensation often focused on the balance wheel and the spring, because those parts set the rhythm. A balance wheel is more than a wheel. It is a rotating mass whose distribution matters. If more mass lies farther from the center, the balance turns more slowly for a given restoring force. If mass moves inward, it turns more quickly. Temperature compensation can use this principle. If a component expands in heat, it can be shaped so that weights shift slightly, changing the balance's effective inertia in a way that counters the change in the spring. It is a quiet adjustment, happening without a hand touching it and without a person noticing. These solutions can feel abstract until you picture the scale. A strip of metal, curved and layered, bends by a barely visible amount when warmed. That bend moves a small weight, a fraction of a millimeter. The fraction of a millimeter alters the balances, timing by a fraction of a second. Over days, that fraction of a second becomes a correction that matters. Harrison's third major timekeeper is often described as the most difficult because it was a long struggle against these subtle errors. It included ideas about temperature compensation and about reducing friction in ways that were new for the period. Years passed while he refined it, and this time scale is part of the biography too. Precision is not a single breakthrough. It is an accumulation of small refusals to accept drift as normal. Then comes the most surprising step, the fourth timekeeper, often called H4. This one begins to look less like a large clock and more like a very large watch. That change in form is not cosmetic. It is a shift in strategy. A watch-style balance and spring, refined by decades of portable horology, could be turned toward the demands of the sea if it could be made stable enough and protected enough and compensated enough. The story of testing at sea carries human moments that are easy to imagine. A timekeeper is packed carefully, protected from salt air and careless hands. It is checked at departure, then it begins its long run. On board, days are marked by routine and weather. Observations are made when the sky allows. Local noon is noted. The traveling time is compared. Each comparison is a small verdict on the mechanism and on the months or years of work behind it. Sea trials in the mid-1700s suggested that Harrison's watch-style timekeeper could keep time with remarkable consistency over long distances. The results did not end the argument immediately. Institutions rarely change their minds in one moment, and other methods of finding longitude continued to compete for authority and funding. There were debates about procedure, about fairness, and about how to judge success. There were also personal tensions because the stakes were high and reputations were involved. Still, the core achievement holds. A practical marine chronometer meant that reference time could be carried, not calculated. It meant that longitude could be found in poor conditions where the moon and stars were hidden. It meant that a navigator could have a steady answer, drawn from a mechanism rather than a long page of numbers. The chronometer also reshaped craftsmanship. Once the goal became clear, makers began refining the type. They improved balances, springs, escapements, and bearings. They improved cases and boxes. They improved isolation by designing mounts that protected the movement from shock. They improved resistance to corrosion and dirt. They improved the discipline of adjustment, so the timekeeper could be regulated carefully before a voyage and checked after. In this period, timekeeping becomes something like a quiet contract between a machine and the world. The machine promises regularity. The world offers motion, salt, temperature swings, and vibration. The chronometer is built as a compromise, shielding itself where it can, correcting itself where it must, and remaining steady enough that the remaining error is small. The deeper point is that longitude turned time into location. The clock was no longer only a personal object, or a marker of status, or a convenience. It became a navigational instrument. It became part of how maps were trusted, and in a wider sense, it became part of how distances were made manageable. Over the later 1700s, marine chronometers became more established and more widely produced in limited numbers for serious use. They were costly, and they were treated with care, but they proved their value. The ocean did not become gentle, but navigation became less blind. A ship could carry a pocket of stability across a moving world. Now, the story begins to move away from single masterpieces and toward systems. If accurate time can guide ships, it can also guide railroads, factories, and cities. Over the next century, the demand shifts from a few exceptional instruments to many dependable ones. After the sea chronometer proves that a portable machine can keep dependable reference time, the question changes again. The ocean demanded a small number of exceptional instruments, built with extreme care. The next demand is broader and more ordinary. It asks for timekeeping that can be made in quantity and trusted by people who will never meet the maker. The 1850s brought what is often called the American system of watchmaking, Waltham and mass production, a shift from artisan benches to factory floors. It also centers a mechanical idea that sounds dry until you picture it clearly: interchangeable parts and tolerance, parts that fit because they are consistently made. For most of the watch's history, the movement inside the case was a personal object in the strictest sense, not just owned by a person, but shaped by a person. A craftsman made wheels, pinions, plates, and pivots, then adjusted them together. Holes were opened and refined. Surfaces were smoothed. Teeth were corrected by eye and feel. The parts were not meant to be swapped casually, because each one had been brought into agreement with its neighbors through small acts of fitting. That style of work can produce beautiful results, and it can also produce scarcity. It requires time, patience, and apprenticeship. It also makes repair a specialized art. If a wheel breaks, a replacement is not simply chosen from a drawer. A replacement must be shaped to suit, then coaxed into harmony with the rest of the train. In the middle of the 1800s, in the United States, a different approach begins to take hold. Instead of building each movement like a small, unique machine, a factory tries to build a type. The goal is not merely to make more watches. The goal is to make watches in a way that repeats, with parts made to a known standard, so that one part can replace another without hand tailoring. When people say interchangeable parts, it can sound like a slogan, but in a watch, it is a strict demand. A watch wheel is not forgiving. If its teeth are slightly too thick, it binds. If they are slightly too thin, it chatters and loses power. If a pivot is slightly oversized, It scrapes and steals energy. If it is undersized, it wobbles, and the gear teeth meet poorly. The whole movement is a chain of small agreements, and the agreements must remain stable. The key word is tolerance. Tolerance is the amount of allowed variation. It is a confession that no factory can create perfect sameness, and an insistence that it does not need to. A part is acceptable if it falls within a narrow band, not too large, not too small. When every part stays inside that band, the assembly works, even if no single part is absolutely identical to another. You can picture tolerance with something simple. Imagine 2 drawers of wooden blocks, all meant to be 1 inch wide. If some are almost 1 inch and some are much smaller, you cannot build a stable wall from them. The gaps will wander and stack. But if every block is within a hair of the same width, the wall becomes predictable. The surface becomes smooth. The structure behaves like a single idea, repeated. Factories turned this idea into a physical practice through gauges and jigs. A gauge is a standard that does not argue. A worker does not have to decide with their eyes alone. The part either passes or it does not. Some gauges are shaped like a slot that a pivot must fit into. Some are shaped like a plug that must enter a hole. Some are built as paired tests, one side that must accept the part, and another side that must reject it. This turns judgment into a quiet ritual check, accept, move on. A jig is different, but related. A jig is a guide that holds a part in the correct position, so that a cut is repeated accurately. If you have to drill thousands of holes in the same location, you do not want each hole to depend on a worker's sense of alignment. You want a fixture that makes the correct choice by design. The jig is the memory of the factory, and the worker becomes the hands that follow it. This is part of what the American system means in practice. It is not only a row of machines. It is a way of thinking about repeatability. It is the decision that the watch can be broken into operations, and that each operation can be stabilized with tools that enforce sameness. Waltham enters as the emblem of this shift, mass production, that moves time from artisan benches to factory floors. In the early 1850s, watchmaking efforts in Massachusetts worked toward building complete watches with factory methods, rather than relying on scattered small workshops. The ambition was not small. It required capital, machinery, skilled supervision, and a workforce trained not only to craft, but to repeat. The factory floor changes the biography of the watch. A single movement is no longer the story of one maker's hands. It becomes the story of many hands, arranged in sequence. One room cuts wheels. Another room turns pinions. Another drills plates. Another finishes pivots. Another polishes. Another assembles. Each person becomes deeply familiar with one portion of the whole, and the whole is carried forward by the rhythm of the building. There is a human calm in that rhythm, and also a human cost. The work can become repetitive. The day can become measured by bells and shifts. The same consistency that makes parts fit also makes time itself feel stricter. Industrial watchmaking does not only produce watches, it produces an environment where time is monitored, because production depends on coordination. This is where the story widens from mechanics to society. Railroads expand in the 1800s, and they change the meaning of distance. If travel between cities is slow, local time differences do not matter much. Noon is noon in each town, and a traveler accepts the drift as part of the journey. But when trains move quickly and schedules are printed, minutes begin to matter. A timetable is a promise, and the promise requires agreement. At first, agreement is awkward. Towns traditionally set their clocks by the sky, by local noon, by the sun reaching its peak. Two towns a modest distance apart can have slightly different local time because they sit on different longitudes. This difference was once an invisible fact. The railroad makes it visible. It places many local times beside one another on a single sheet of paper. Then the telegraph amplifies the effect. With electrical signals traveling fast across long wires, time can be shared. A reference clock in a city can send a signal outward. Other clocks can be set to match. This does not require everyone to see the same sun at the same moment. It requires a decision to trust a distant standard. This is one of the quiet transformations of the industrial era. The watch becomes smaller and more available through factory production. And at the same time, the world becomes more synchronized through communication and transport. People begin to live inside shared time in a new way. Work begins at a listed hour. Trains depart at a listed minute. Meetings happen by the clock rather than by a vague portion of the day. Whole cities begin agreeing on now, society choosing one shared heartbeat. Inside the watch, the shared heartbeat depends again on tolerance. Factory watchmaking forces makers to define what matters most. Some dimensions can vary a little without harm. Others must be held tightly. The balance staff must be true. The jewel holes must be consistent. The gear teeth must mesh cleanly. So the factory learns to invest effort where the mechanism is most sensitive. This changes the nature of quality. In an artisan shop, quality might mean elegance of finish, cleverness of design, and the skill of fitting. In a factory system, quality also means process control, the ability to make 100 parts that behave like one, then 1,000, then more. It is a different kind of craft. The craft moves from the wrist and fingertips into the design of tools and the discipline of measurement. It also changes repair. If a movement is built from parts that are truly interchangeable, then a watch can be serviced more quickly. A damaged wheel can be replaced with another wheel of the same type. A worn part can be swapped rather than remade. This is not only convenience. It is a new promise of longevity. The watch becomes a product that can be supported at scale. There is a subtle mechanical beauty in this because it echoes earlier themes in the story. The fusee smoothed the uneven force of a spring by changing leverage. Jewel bearings reduced loss by letting parts touch less. The The chronometer sheltered its movement to survive a hostile environment. The factory system is another kind of shelter. It shelters accuracy from human variability by turning variability into controlled tolerances. Of course, the factory does not erase the need for human judgment. Watches still require adjustment. They still require regulation. They still require care with lubrication, with cleanliness, with assembly. But the balance shifts. More of the movement's behavior is determined before the watch ever reaches the bench, because the parts have been made to align with one another from the start. Over time, this industrial approach spreads. American factories refine their methods. Other regions respond, sometimes by adopting similar tools, sometimes by specializing in different strengths. The market broadens. More people can own reliable timekeeping. And as more people own it, the social structures around time grow tighter. Time becomes not only personal, but civic. This sets the stage for another habit change, one that will arrive under pressure rather than by slow preference. As factories learn to make parts that fit by consistency, timekeeping becomes ordinary and widely carried. A watch is no longer rare, and the idea of a shared schedule spreads. Then, a new kind of pressure arrives, not from commerce or railroads, but from war. During World War I, the needs of soldiers and officers reshape a daily habit from pocket to wrist, because time must be checked quickly, often with both hands busy. The trench watch appears as a practical answer, and it brings a set of changes that feel like calm problem solving. Wire lugs, sturdier cases, clearer dials, and thicker crystals. In the same period, another small technology becomes surprisingly important. Luminescence, numerals that hold light and return it slowly in darkness. For centuries, the pocket watch had been the portable form of time. It lived in a vest pocket or a coat tethered by a chain. To read it, you had to reach inside clothing, pull it free, open a cover if it had one, and then look down. In a quiet street, this is easy. In a crowd, it is still manageable. In mud, cold, and noise, it becomes a more complicated act. Before the war, wristwatches existed, but they were often treated as jewelry, and more often worn by women than men. Men who cared about serious timekeeping tended to trust the familiar weight of a watch in the pocket. It was protected by fabric and habit. It was close to the body and less exposed to impact. The wrist, by contrast, is always moving, always reaching, and always bumping into the world. Then Europe enters the conflict in 1914, and the environment of time changes. Modern warfare depends on coordination. It depends on artillery barrages timed to the minute, infantry movements planned against those barrages, and communications that can fail without warning. A small delay can shift a meeting point or leave a unit exposed. In that setting, checking time becomes an action done repeatedly, not a polite glance done once. The trenches add their own demands. A soldier often carries equipment in both hands. A rifle, a shovel, a message, or a stretcher can fill the grip. Gloves make fine motions clumsy. Mud makes pockets unreliable. A pocket watch can be hard to reach and easy to drop. Even when it is reached safely, the act takes time, and it draws attention inward for a moment that may not feel safe. A watch on the wrist answers this in the simplest way. It keeps the time visible. It can be checked with a brief turn of the arm without opening a coat and without letting go of what the hands are doing. In the war, that convenience becomes a form of control. It is a small reduction in effort, repeated many times a day, in conditions where effort is costly. The trench watch begins as an adaptation. Many early examples were pocket watch movements placed into cases built for the wrist, or pocket watches modified with attachments. The key feature is the lug, the part that lets a strap hold the watch to the wrist. Some early lugs were simple wire shapes, fixed to the case like small handles. A strap could pass through them, and the watch would sit flat enough to read. This sounds like a minor change, but it reshapes the whole object. A pocket watch can assume it will lie against soft fabric. A wristwatch must assume it will strike wood, metal, and stone. It will be scraped by gear and pressed against the ground. It will be exposed to rain and sweat, and to grit that finds its way into every seam. So the case evolves quickly. It becomes sturdier, with stronger backs and tighter joins. The glass over the dial, often called the crystal, becomes thicker because it is now the front surface of an object worn outward. In some trench watches, additional metal guards appear over the crystal as simple bars meant to reduce shattering. These choices are not about style. They are about survival of the instrument. The dial changes as well, because readability becomes a kind of safety. In dim light and under stress, a small ornate dial is a liability. Numerals become larger. Markings become clearer. Hands become darker against a lighter background. The second hand, which had always been part of fine timekeeping, gains new importance because timing intervals matters in military life, from coordinating movement to tracking signals. The crown, the small knob used to wind and set the watch, also becomes more usable. A crown that is easy to grip is easier to turn with cold fingers or through gloves. Winding is still a daily ritual, and in wartime it becomes part of personal equipment care, like cleaning a weapon or checking supplies. This is where the biography thread becomes easy to imagine, because the object sits close to lived moments. An officer checks the time, then looks up at a line of men waiting. A messenger glances down before running across open ground, measuring minutes as if they were distance. A medic counts a pulse, watching the second hand move, steady and indifferent. The watch is not the cause of these events, but it becomes a tool inside them, a small, steady reference that helps decisions feel less blind. In the air, the wristwatch is also useful. Early military aviation brings new kinds of timing, fuel checks, distance estimates, and navigation by dead reckoning. A pilot cannot easily pull a watch from a pocket while managing controls. A glance at the wrist is enough. watch becomes part of a cockpit routine, close to the body, close to the immediate work of staying oriented. Now, the mechanical thread returns, because a wristwatch is still a watch, and it carries the same heartbeat inside. The balance wheel and hairspring continue their back and forth motion, each swing taking nearly the same time, each impulse from the escapement keeping the rhythm alive. But the environment is harsher. Shocks can disturb the balance. Vibrations can loosen screws. Dust can reach the gears. A more rugged case helps, but ruggedness also depends on internal stability. Jewel bearings, already part of quality movements, matter here too, because they reduce wear when conditions are dirty and oil is imperfect. A pivot turning in a hard jewel hole is less likely to become sloppy quickly. The same principle that protected the watch over years in a city now protects it over months in a trench. Then there is the question of reading the time at night, or in low light, without lighting a flame. Darkness in wartime is not just inconvenient. It is a tactical condition. A small light can reveal a position. A watch that can be read without an external light becomes valuable. This is where luminescence enters, and it is a technology with a quiet and almost gentle behavior. The basic idea is that certain materials can absorb energy and then release it as visible light. In some cases, they do this after being exposed to light, glowing slowly as the stored energy returns to the world. The effect is like warmth held in stone after a sunny day, except it is light rather than heat. In the early 1900s, luminous watch paint often used a mixture where a radioactive ingredient excited a phosphorescent material, causing it to glow continuously. The glow could last through the night without needing to be charged by daylight. It was effective, and it fit the practical need of the moment. Later, the dangers of some of these materials became clear, especially for workers who handled the paint daily. This is part of the story too, a reminder that new convenience can carry unseen costs. On the dial, luminescence is placed where it helps most, on the numerals, on the hour markers, and on the hands. A watch face becomes a small map of glowing points. The hands sweep across that map, and the time can be read with a glance, even when the rest of the world is dim. It is important to notice how this changes the experience of the watch. A pocket watch in a pocket is dark, and you must bring it into light to read it. A luminous wristwatch is already legible. It does not demand a separate action. It quietly offers the information. By 1918, when the war ends, a large number of men have learned to live with time on the wrist. Habits formed under pressure do not always fade when the pressure is gone. The wristwatch follows soldiers home. It becomes familiar in daily life, not as a novelty, but as a practical tool. The 1920s then turned that tool into a social standard. Industry is already capable of producing watches in quantity, and the wristwatch fits the rhythm of modern work. It is easier to check during a busy day. It does not require a chain. It does not require pockets designed for it. It works with new styles of clothing and with new forms of movement, driving, commuting, and working with tools. There's also a quieter shift in what the wristwatch symbolizes. The pocket watch had been tied to older forms of formality and to a world where time was carried but not constantly referenced. The wristwatch feels modern, like an instrument worn openly, ready to be consulted. It matches an era where schedules tighten and where public life depends on coordination. Watchmakers respond to this demand with further refinement. Cases become more standardized in shape and size. Dials become cleaner. Hands become easier to read. Crystals become more resilient. Straps become more varied in material and fit. Some watches begin to resist dust and moisture better, not perfectly, but enough to suit daily wear. This is still an age of winding, and the daily winding ritual remains. A person turns the crown, feeling the mainspring tighten, feeling the steady resistance rise, then stop. It is the same basic act that once belonged to early pocket watches, now repeated on the wrist. And as more people wear watches constantly, the inconvenience of daily winding becomes more noticeable, not because it is difficult, but because it is one more small requirement in a world already full of requirements. So the wristwatch does not only win the war, it wins the habit of being worn all day, every day. It becomes the default place where time lives on the body. And once time lives there, people begin to want it to take care of itself. It then moved to a new kind of convenience, the self-winding watch. The focus then turns to the automatic movement and to a mechanism that quietly harvests ordinary motion, a swinging weight inside the case that turns movement into stored power, so the watch can keep going with less attention. Once the wristwatch becomes an everyday companion, a new expectation settles in. A watch is checked often and worn through entire days, and the small daily act of winding, once normal, begins to feel like one more task that never stops. This era introduced the automatic wristwatch, and in the early 1920s, the idea that winding could become optional. The turning point is John Harwood, and a self-winding design meant to take care of itself through ordinary movement. The key mechanical image is simple: a half-moon weight that swings and turns inside the case, quietly converting motion into stored power. It helps to begin with the older ritual because the automatic is built as a response to it. A manual wristwatch stores energy in a mainspring, a coiled ribbon of metal inside a barrel. Each morning or each evening, the crown is turned. The spring tightens, storing force. Then, over the next day, the spring relaxes slowly, pushing the gear train forward, feeding the escapement, and sustaining the balance wheel's repeated swing. The ritual is small, but it is strict. If it is forgotten, the watch stops. If it is delayed, the watch may run down during the night. After World War I, as more people wear wristwatches daily, the rhythm of winding becomes more noticeable, not because it is difficult, but because it is frequent. The automatic watch begins with a quiet question. If the watch is already moving through the day, why not use that motion Why not turn the motion of walking, working, and reaching into winding energy, so the mainspring is kept near its useful range without deliberate attention? This is why the phrase perpetual motion often appears near the automatic, even when no one believes in impossibility. A watch cannot create energy. It can only gather it and store it and spend it slowly. The automatic is not a machine that runs forever by itself. It is a machine that listens to its environment and takes small gifts of motion when they appear. In the early 1920s, John Harwood is closely associated with the first practical push to make this common in wristwatches. The aim was clear: make daily winding optional and let timekeeping take care of itself. Harwood was a watch repairer from Bolton in England, someone who spent long hours with ordinary watches, seeing their patterns of wear and their everyday failures. A repairer learns something specific. They see the places where design meets habit. They see which crowns snap, which stems wear, which parts suffer from dirt and moisture, which cases admit grit. They also see how people use a watch and how often it is handled. In that setting, the desire to reduce handling can become a practical goal, not a fantasy. Harwood's approach is often described as a central oscillating weight, a moving mass inside the watch that swings as the wrist moves. This is the heart of the automatic, the rotor. A half-moon weight, and that shape matters. A half circle of metal can be heavy, yet compact. It can swing without needing a full circle of space. To picture it clearly, imagine the movement as a small flat city of gears, bridges, and wheels. Above that city, a weighted arm is mounted on a pivot. When the watch tilts, the weight tries to fall. When the watch swings back, the weight lags behind, then catches up. It does not move with intention. It moves because gravity and inertia keep tugging it into the lowest available position. Each time that weight swings, it can drive a set of gears that lead toward the mainspring barrel. But if it drove those gears directly in both directions, the mechanism would fight itself. One swing would wind, and the return swing would unwind. So the automatic needs a one-way gate, a small mechanical rule that says energy is allowed to go into the spring, but it is not allowed to come back out through this path. A ratchet is a way to allow motion forward while blocking motion backward. In everyday life, it is felt in tools that click as they turn, advancing in steps that do not reverse. In a watch, the same idea is miniaturized. The rotor swings, a gear train catches, a click holds, and a small amount of wind is added. Then the rotor swings back, and the gears are allowed to slip in a way that does not pull energy out of the spring. The result is a repetitive conversion, not dramatic, but steady. Swing, catch, wind. Swing, catch, wind. The watch is not wound all at once. It is topped up in small pieces, gathered from movement that would have happened anyway. Harwood's early designs are also associated with a particular style of rotor motion, later called a bumper. The weight swings through a limited arc, not a full circle, and it meets spring buffers at the ends of its travel. The sensation is gentle but distinct. The weight reaches its limit, contacts a buffer, then swings back the other way. The buffering helps protect the mechanism from harsh impacts, and it fits the confined space of early cases. This limited arc also reveals a practical truth. The automatic does not need to spin constantly. It needs to move enough, often enough, to make up for the energy the watch spends. Every mechanical watch is a slow bargain between power and loss. The mainspring offers force. Friction and the escapement consume it. The balance wheel requires repeated impulses. The automatic adds a new income stream of energy, but the spending remains. Because Harwood's system aimed to reduce handling, it also led to another notable choice: the removal of a traditional winding crown. With no crown used for winding, the case could be made more sealed against dust and moisture. But then another question appears: how to set the time? Harwood's solution, described in surviving examples, was a bezel setting system where the hands are set by rotating the front bezel rather than turning a crown. A small indicator could show whether the watch was in a hand setting mode or in a winding mode. This is a reminder that mechanical design is rarely isolated. Change one habit, and several related habits must be redesigned. The early 1920s are a period of intense adaptation in wristwatches. The wristwatch has just emerged from wartime necessity into everyday life. People want durability, readability, and convenience. The automatic addresses convenience in a deep way by making the watch less dependent on deliberate daily care. There is also a calm human moment behind this, because automatic winding responds to ordinary forgetfulness. A person can be busy, distracted, tired, or rushing. A watch that can stay alive through routine movement feels more forgiving. It does not remove responsibility completely, but it reduces the number of times the watch demands attention. Mechanically, though, an automatic watch must be carefully balanced between too much winding and too little. If the rotor system is weak, the watch will still run down and the benefit disappears. If the winding system is too aggressive, it can strain parts and the watch becomes fragile. The gear ratios between the rotor and the mainspring must be chosen with care, because the rotor moves often, but with small and varying force. This is another place where the factory era matters. By the 1920s, watchmaking has more industrial capability than before. Parts can be made with greater consistency. Jewels can reduce wear at key pivots. Better finishing can reduce friction. These improvements make the automatic concept more practical than it had been in earlier centuries, when similar self-winding ideas existed mostly in pocket watches and in rare mechanisms. Harwood's patents sit in this moment. Sources describe patents in 1923 and 1924 associated with his self-winding wristwatch design, and later commercialization and production followed after financial backing and manufacturing arrangements. The exact sequence of filing, granting, and scaling is complex, and different accounts emphasize different milestones. the mechanical image remains stable. The wristwatch becomes a device that can harvest movement through an internal weight and guide that movement into the mainspring through one-way action. It is also worth noticing what the automatic does not change. It does not change the heartbeat. Inside, the balance wheel and hairspring still swing back and forth, and the escapement still divides energy into measured pushes. The automatic changes only the source of energy replenishment. It keeps the spring wound more consistently, which can also help the watch run in a steadier portion of its power curve. That steadiness matters because even with a fusee long behind us, mainsprings still behave differently when nearly full versus nearly empty. The automatic tends to keep the spring in the middle, where the force can be more stable. This does not make the watch perfect, but it can make it more consistent, which is often the deeper goal. There's a quiet beauty in how indirect the automatic is. A person moves through the day, and the watch moves inside the person's movement. The rotor swings in response. The gear train takes what it can. The ratchet action ensures the energy goes into storage, not back out. And the stored energy is released slowly and evenly, turning hours of ordinary motion into a steady stream of time. One can imagine the early wearer becoming aware of this only faintly, perhaps a subtle sensation as the weight meets its buffer. Perhaps a slight change in how often the watch needs to be wound by hand. Perhaps nothing at all, which is part of the point. The automatic is designed to disappear into habit. Over the following years, the automatic idea is refined and adopted in different forms. Some later systems use rotors that can turn through a full circle, which can feel smoother and can gather energy more efficiently. Others focus on better sealing, better shock resistance, and better durability of the winding train. The automatic becomes less like an experiment and more like a standard option for a modern wristwatch. The watch is becoming increasingly self-contained. First, it learned to regulate itself better with the balance spring. Then it learned to protect itself from wear with jewels. Then it learned to survive motion at sea through careful design. Then it learned to be manufactured as a dependable object in quantity. Then it moved to the wrist and gained readability in darkness. And now it learns to feed itself quietly from the movement of daily life. The next turning point is not a refinement of the spring and gear world, but a shock from outside it. After the automatic watch learns to gather small moments of motion and turn them into stored power, the wristwatch feels more self-contained. The mechanism still depends on springs and gears, but it asks for less attention. And in that quiet convenience, it becomes easier to notice a larger truth. The old heartbeat is still a compromise. Now we arrive at the quartz crisis, beginning in 1969, when Seiko's Astron arrives as a public demonstration of a different kind of accuracy, and the watch world has to decide what it is selling, time or craft. The shift is not only technical, it is cultural. It changes factories, jobs, expectations, and even the sound and motion of a second hand. To understand why 1969 feels like a cliff edge, it helps to remember what a mechanical watch is always doing. Inside the case, energy is stored in a mainspring and then released through gears. The escapement interrupts that release, turning a steady push into small impulses. The balance wheel and hairspring swing back and forth, each swing taking close to the same amount of time, each one measuring a fraction of a second. The system is elegant, and it is also vulnerable. It depends on clean surfaces, stable oils, and carefully adjusted parts. It is never perfectly isolated from heat, shock, and wear. Even the best mechanical watch is a careful agreement with the physical world. Metal expands and contracts. Lubrication ages. Tiny shocks change tiny alignments. A watch can be made remarkably stable, but it must always work against these small disturbances. Over centuries, watchmakers learned to tame them and to make the errors small enough that daily life could trust the result. Quartz timekeeping begins with a different agreement. It does not try to coax precision out of gears and springs. It starts with a material that naturally prefers a steady rhythm, and then it counts that rhythm directly. Instead of a balance wheel swinging a few times per second, it uses a crystal vibrating tens of thousands of times per second. Instead of a mechanical escapement, it uses electronics that count without fatigue. Quartz had been used in clocks before wristwatches. Large quartz clocks existed in laboratories and institutions where stable frequency mattered more than size. They were not portable in the way a wristwatch is portable. They were often bulky and power-hungry, and they belonged to the world of measurement, not the world of personal objects. In the mid-1900s, electronics changed rapidly. Components shrank. Power consumption fell. Batteries improved. Integrated circuits made it possible to count fast signals reliably in a small space. As these pieces matured, the idea of a quartz wristwatch shifted from a distant ideal into a manufacturable object. The core mechanical image of quartz timekeeping is simple and precise. A small sliver of quartz is cut in a particular shape. When an electrical voltage is applied, the quartz bends and vibrates. This is the piezoelectric effect, where mechanical motion and electrical charge are linked through the structure of the crystal. Quartz is useful because its vibration is stable. It resists drifting when conditions change, far more than many other materials. In many wristwatches, the chosen vibration frequency is 32,768 cycles per second. This number is not magic, but it is convenient. It is a power of 2. If you divide 32,768 by 2, you get 16,384. Divide again and again and again, and after 15 divisions you reach 1. This makes the electronic design straightforward. A chip can count the crystal's vibration, divide it down through simple stages, and produce a 1-second pulse with calm regularity. That 1-second pulse can then do something physical. It can drive a tiny motor, often a stepper motor, turns in small jumps. Each pulse moves the motor by one step. Those steps are translated through gears into the motion of the hands. The minute hand advances smoothly enough that it looks continuous. The second hand, in many quartz watches, advances in distinct steps, one jump per second. This is where a small sensory difference becomes symbolic. Mechanical watches often have a sweeping seconds hand because the balance wheel beats several times per second. The hand moves in many tiny increments, creating a smooth glide across the dial. Quartz watches often have a deadbeat seconds hand, a clear step from one marker to the next. Step, pause, step, pause. The difference is not only visual, it changes the feeling of the watch. The mechanical sweep can feel like flowing motion. The quartz step can feel like clean counting. Neither motion is inherently better. They are two kinds of comfort. One is the comfort of a continuous glide, like a steady stream. The other is the comfort of discrete steps, like a calm metronome. What changes in 1969 is not a verdict. What changes is that the second kind of comfort becomes available with far higher accuracy for far less complexity. Seiko's Astron arrives into this landscape as a public statement. It is a wristwatch that treats time as a signal to be counted, not a rhythm to be coaxed from metal. It is expensive at first, and it is not immediately a mass object, but it proves something that cannot be unseen. A portable watch can be extraordinarily accurate, and it can do so with a different heart. You can imagine the engineers and technicians behind such a device. Their work is not the slow polishing of pivots, and not the careful bending of a hairspring. Their work is the shaping of crystal, the design of circuits, the control of electrical noise, the management of power consumption, and the packaging of fragile electronics into a case meant for daily life. It is still craft, but it is a different craft, closer to the emerging world of modern electronics. At the same time, you can imagine a traditional watchmaker looking at the result with mixed attention. The watch is still a watch. It still has hands, a dial, a case, and a wearer. But inside, the familiar language has changed. There is no escapement to adjust in the old sense. There is no balance spring to tune by tiny turns. There is a vibrating crystal and a counting chip. The skill set that dominates is no longer the same skill set that built the industry. This is why the word crisis enters the story. The crisis is not that mechanical watches stop working. The crisis is that the market begins to ask a harsh question. If a quartz watch can keep far better time and can be made more cheaply, what is the mechanical watch for? In the 1970s, this question becomes unavoidable. Quartz technology spreads quickly. Production scales. Prices fall. Accuracy becomes common rather than rare. For many consumers, the watch becomes primarily a tool, and the tool is expected to be correct without fuss. A quartz watch can run for long periods on a small battery. It can tolerate ordinary neglect. It can be made thin, light, and inexpensive. It can be sold as a reliable instrument for everyday life. Mechanical watchmaking especially in Switzerland, had long been built on mastery of tiny parts and refined assembly. It had also been built on export markets and established prestige. Quartz disrupts all of those assumptions at once. It undercuts the idea that superior timekeeping requires traditional complexity. It shifts value from mechanical refinement to electronic design and manufacturing scale. It also invites new competitors because the barrier to entry changes. The core problems become electrical and industrial, not purely horological. In workshops and factories, the impact becomes human. When an industry is reorganized by a new technology, the changes show up first as layoffs, mergers, and closures. They show up as skilled workers asked to do less skilled work, or asked to learn unfamiliar techniques, or asked to leave a craft entirely. They show up as family businesses squeezed by new pricing realities. They show up as institutions trying to decide whether to resist, adapt, or redefine their purpose. The story is not uniform. Some groups in Switzerland pursue quartz research themselves. Some collaborate and share development through industry efforts. Some brands release quartz models and try to compete directly. Others hold back, betting that mechanical watches will remain desirable for reasons that have nothing to do with pure accuracy. Those reasons are real, and they are subtle. A mechanical watch does not only tell time, it shows time being made. Its heartbeat can be felt, sometimes even heard. Its motion is visible in the sweep of the second's hand, and in the behavior of the crown when winding. It carries a history of human solutions, from the fusee to the balance spring to jeweled bearings. A quartz watch, by contrast, hides its work more completely. Its heartbeat is too fast to perceive. Its counting is silent. Its accuracy is almost impersonal. This contrast becomes central to how the industry survives. When accuracy becomes cheap, mechanical watchmaking begins to move toward other values: durability, design, tradition, finishing, and the sense of a mechanism as an object worthy of attention. In other words, the mechanical watch begins to lean into craft. This does not happen overnight. It takes time for markets to reorganize. It takes time for brands to decide who they are. Some mechanical makers embrace modernization, using better materials and more consistent manufacturing. Some lean into luxury, treating the movement as sculpture and emphasizing hand finishing and heritage. Some are forced to consolidate because survival requires scale and capital. Quartz, meanwhile, becomes the everyday standard. It is not only in watches. It spreads through devices that keep their own time, quietly and constantly. Clocks in homes, in offices, in appliances, in cars, and later in computers, all begin to depend on stable oscillators and electronic counting. The idea of time as a shared signal, already growing with telegraphs and standardized schedules, becomes even more embedded. Time becomes a background service. And yet, even within quartz watches, there is still a kind of mechanical poetry. A crystal vibrates invisibly, like a silent hummingbird wing. A chip counts with patient repetition, turning a fast rhythm into a slow and usable pulse. A tiny motor moves by measured steps, and a gear train translates those steps into familiar hands. In this sense, quartz does not erase the old world completely. It keeps the dial and hands, but changes the source of the heartbeat. If you return to the second hand, the contrast becomes easy to hold. A mechanical sweep suggests continuity, many tiny beats per second, blended into a glide. A quartz step suggests discrete measurement, one clean tick per second, counted and delivered without hesitation. These are two different languages for the same idea. 1 minute passing, 1 hour passing, 1 day passing. By the end of the 1970s and into the decades that follow, the watch world becomes more plural. Quartz dominates everyday accuracy and affordability. Mechanical watches persist and even flourish in a different role, less as the best tool for telling time, and more as an object of meaning, engineering, and aesthetics. The crisis, in that sense, becomes a redefinition rather than an ending. After quartz turns time into a counted signal, the watch world becomes wider rather than smaller. Accuracy becomes ordinary, and setting a clock becomes less common. The question is no longer only how time is kept, but where time now lives. All of this leading to the modern era and a divergence that feels strangely calm. On one side, the smartwatch treats time as a platform for information, health, and communication. On the other side, high horology treats time as sculpture and keeps building mechanical marvels, even when perfect accuracy is no longer the point. Between them is a quiet infrastructure, atomic references, satellite time signals, and phones that agree on now without anyone noticing. In earlier centuries, the personal timekeeper demanded a ritual. A key, a crown, a careful setting. The mainspring had to be fed. The fusee had to do its quiet leverage work. The balance wheel needed its spring to keep the swings equal. The jewels needed clean oil. The chronometer needed a protected box. Time was carried, but it was also maintained. In the modern era, much of that maintenance moves out of sight. Time is often received rather than kept. A device connects to a network, and the time arrives already agreed upon. Clocks update themselves when time zones change. They shift for daylight-saving rules without a hand touching them. The idea of a reference time, once carried across an ocean in a wooden box, is now broadcast constantly and accepted quietly. Atomic time is the anchor beneath this. An atomic clock does not measure time by gears or springs or even by the vibration of a crystal. It measures time by the behavior of atoms, using a frequency that is remarkably stable. In simple terms, an atom can be encouraged to oscillate between energy states at a precise rate, and that oscillation becomes a standard. It is not a perfect standard in a philosophical sense, but it is stable enough that modern society can build systems upon it. Satellite navigation systems use atomic clocks in orbit to provide position and time, because position depends on precise timing. A receiver compares signals from several satellites and calculates where it must be to make those signals line up. The calculation is fundamentally about distance, but distance becomes time because signals travel at a known speed. In that environment, time is not a number on a dial. It is a coordinate. Phones and computers use time servers and cellular networks to align their internal clocks with these standards. The alignment is not always perfect at the level of microseconds because networks have delays and devices are imperfect. But for daily life, the agreement is strong enough that most clocks display the same minute without being manually set. Time becomes a background utility, like clean water from a tap, present unless something breaks. This is one half of the modern story, time as infrastructure. The other half is time as a personal object again, worn and handled, even when it is not needed for accuracy. The smartwatch sits directly in that space. It is, in one sense, a watch. It sits on the wrist. It offers the hour and minute at a glance. But its deeper identity is closer to a small computer that happens to be worn in the place where watches have long lived. The historical path toward this is gradual. As electronics become smaller and cheaper, watches gain more functions, simple alarms, timers, and digital displays. Then, as phones become constant companions, the watch becomes an extension of the phone, a second screen, a sensor hub, and a notification device. The wrist becomes a place for information that needs to be checked quickly, without pulling a larger device from a pocket. This returns to an older theme from the trenches, convenience under pressure. But the pressure is different. It is not artillery or darkness. It is the speed of modern attention. Messages arrive, calendars update, navigation prompts appear. A wrist display allows these to be acknowledged in a glance, with minimal interruption. The smartwatch also changes what is measured. A mechanical watch measures time and nothing else. A quartz watch measures time with a crystal and counts it. A smartwatch measures time, but it also measures the body. It samples heart rate. It estimates movement. It tracks sleep patterns and exercise sessions. It can detect falls and send alerts. It becomes an instrument not only of time, but of daily health. This is a quiet shift in meaning. For most of history, a watch told time, and time told a story about schedules, trains, ships, and cities. In the smartwatch era, the watch tells time, and it also tells a story about the person wearing it, their movement, their pulse, their location, their habits across days. Mechanically, the smartwatch is also part of a different economy of power. A mechanical watch stores energy in a coiled spring. An automatic gathers energy through a swinging weight. A smartwatch stores energy in a battery and must be recharged. It trades independence for capability. It can do more, but it must be fed with electricity, more often than a quartz watch, and far more often than a mechanical one. And yet, inside the smartwatch, timekeeping itself is almost effortless. The time signal is drawn from a crystal oscillator, from network references, or from both. The device does not drift for long. because it is corrected routinely. It is not a lone instrument negotiating with friction and temperature in isolation. It is part of a larger chorus, constantly being tuned. In parallel, a very different modern object continues to exist, and it is built around the oldest heartbeat of all, the escapement, the balance wheel, and the spring. This is where high horology lives, the world of mechanical watches made not because they are necessary, but because they are desired. One of the most symbolic mechanisms in that world is the tourbillon. The tourbillon is not new in the modern era. It was conceived in the early 1800s as a response to a specific problem. Pocket watches often rested in a single vertical position for long periods. Gravity could influence the balance and escapement slightly differently depending on orientation. Those small differences could accumulate into a noticeable rate error. The tourbillon attempts to average those errors by rotating the escapement, and often the balance as well, inside a small cage. Instead of leaving the escapement in one position, it is turned through all positions in a slow cycle. In many traditional tourbillons, the cage rotates once per minute, like a deliberate orbit. To picture it, imagine the heart of the watch held inside a tiny frame, a miniature carousel. The balance wheel continues to swing. The escapement continues to lock and release, but the entire assembly is carried around in a circle, steadily, with patient motion. The mechanism is both functional and theatrical, because it exposes the heartbeat and sets it in motion. In a modern wristwatch, the tourbillon is not always a necessary solution. A wristwatch changes position constantly. It faces shocks, swings, and varied orientations throughout a day. The benefit of a tourbillon as an averaging device is smaller in many everyday contexts. And so, in the modern era, the tourbillon becomes something else. It becomes an expression of what mechanical watchmaking can do. It becomes a symbol that the craft is willing to build complexity for its own sake, to build a moving sculpture inside a closed case, simply because it can be done, and because someone will appreciate the result. This is where finishing enters the story. The quiet, modern details that exist only because someone wanted the inside to be beautiful too. Polishing a steel surface until it reflects like a dark mirror. Beveling an edge so light catches it cleanly. Circular graining on plates, repeating patterns made by abrasive tips, placed carefully in overlapping rings. Straight stripes across bridges, aligned and even. Screws with polished heads and crisp slots. Jewels set not only for function, but for visual order. None of this improves accuracy in the direct way quartz improved accuracy. Some of it can improve reliability by smoothing surfaces and reducing burrs, but much of it is aesthetic discipline. It is the craft insisting that the unseen deserves care. This creates a modern paradox that is more peaceful than it sounds. The most accurate time in daily life is often delivered by devices that were not built as watches at all: phones, computers, networked systems, and satellites. At the same time, watch that is most cherished may be the one that measures time less perfectly, because it offers something else: a visible heartbeat, a tangible link to centuries of mechanical thought. In this sense, modern timekeeping splits into two kinds of reassurance. One kind is correctness, time that is synchronized, corrected, and dependable because it is shared. Another kind is presence, time that is made locally inside a small machine where the passage of seconds is not just displayed, but physically produced. The smartwatch leans toward correctness and service. It is a portal to schedules, to messages, to navigation, to health metrics. It treats time as one layer among many. It is practical, not because it is romantic, but because it is integrated. It belongs to the same world as the telegraph and the standardized railroad schedule. Except now the schedule is carried everywhere and updated everywhere. The tourbillon watch leans toward presence and intention. It treats time as the main event again, not because time cannot be found elsewhere, but because the act of finding it inside a mechanism still matters. It is closer to the early watchmaker's bench, except now the bench work is often more refined than ever, and the result is framed as art. And both objects, in their own way, are modern. The modern era is not one path. It is a set of paths that run side by side. There is also a third quiet path, perhaps the most influential, the world where time is not worn at all. Time is embedded in systems. It is embedded in banking transactions, in network logs, in GPS-based navigation, in server coordination, in video synchronization, in communications. These systems depend on precise timing, far beyond what the human wrist requires. Yet, they deliver that precision without making it visible. This invisibility shapes daily experience. A person may wear a smartwatch that updates itself, while also wearing a mechanical watch that must be adjusted. The person may rely on their phone to be correct to the minute, and then choose a mechanical watch for the feeling of it. These choices are not contradictions. They are different answers to different human needs. When the tourbillon rotates, it does so at a pace that can be watched. It is slow enough to be followed. When a quartz crystal vibrates, it does so far too quickly to see. When an atomic clock counts, it does so in a way that is almost abstract. The modern era contains all of these rhythms, stacked together, some visible, some silent, some worn, some hidden in infrastructure. The long arc of watch history has been a sequence of refinements, each one narrowing error and expanding usefulness. The mainspring makes portability possible. The fusee steadies power. The balance spring steadies rate. Jewels reduce wear. The chronometer makes time into navigation. Factories make precision widespread. The wristwatch makes time immediate. The automatic reduces attention. Quartz makes correctness cheap. And now, in the modern era, time becomes both ubiquitous and optional, both everywhere and chosen. A smartwatch can quietly check the pulse and display the hour, while a tourbillon turns like a small planet inside a case. both of them riding on top of atomic standards that keep the world aligned. And in that layered world, the most striking fact may be the simplest one. Time can be counted with nearly perfect regularity now, but the act of keeping time in any form still reflects what is valued. Some machines keep time so the world can coordinate. Some keep time so a person can feel the seconds move. And somewhere between the broadcast certainty of atomic reference and the slow orbit of a rotating cage, the same quiet question continues. Not only what time is, but what it is for.